Mara Calloway stood on the front steps of the house she had built with her own hands and watched a stranger change the lock. Not a stranger, really. Her husband of 30 years. But the man turning that key had never once held a sander, never mixed mortar, never stayed up until 2 in the morning, deciding whether the kitchen light was warm enough to make a family feel safe. She had done all of that. Every room in that house remembered her. The porch she had re-leveled board by board. The east wing she had saved when the original load-bearing wall plan was wrong and nobody else caught it. The garden she had planted in the 3rd year of their marriage when the soil was still clay and nobody believed anything would grow. The court called it Dennis Calloway's house. 30 years of her hands. 30 years of her decisions. 30 years of her name quietly removed from every invoice, every contract, every public record, one clean signature at a time. She left with 2 suitcases, but before she reached the end of Harlow Street, she opened the glove compartment and found what her grandmother had left her. A blue envelope, an iron key, and a note in handwriting she would have recognized anywhere. Smoky Mountains. The cabin knows your name. Grandma Lois had been gone for 5 years. She had also, it turned out, been preparing for this exact day for 28 years. Mara Calloway stood on the front steps of the house she had built with her own hands and watched a stranger change the lock. Not a stranger, really. Her husband of 30 years. But the man turning that key had never once held a sander, never mixed mortar, never stayed up until 2 in the morning, deciding whether the kitchen light was warm enough to make a family feel safe inside it. She had done all of that. Every room in that house remembered her. The porch she had re-leveled board by board one summer when the wood had begun to separate, and Dennis had said it was fine, that it was cosmetic, that nobody would notice. Mara had noticed. Mara had fixed it. The east wing she had saved when the original load-bearing wall plan turned out to be wrong, and the contractor hadn't caught it. And Dennis wasn't there, because Dennis was rarely there. And Mara had stood in the unfinished frame of that room with the blueprints spread across a sawdust-covered floor and found the mistake herself. The garden she had planted in the 3rd year of their marriage when the soil was still hard Carolina clay, and the landscape company had told her nothing would take root, and she had spent 2 weekends turning that ground by hand until it gave. The court called it Dennis Calloway's house. She left with 2 suitcases and a cedar chest, and the photograph of her grandmother that had lived on the kitchen windowsill for 11 years. Dennis did not try to stop her. He stood in the doorway of the living room she had designed and watched her go with the particular calm of a man who had already won and knew it. Outside the magnolia tree she had planted the year they almost lost the house to a bad refinancing deal, dropped 1 white petal onto the front walk. Mara did not look back. She carried her things to the car, placed the cedar chest carefully in the trunk, and sat behind the wheel for a long moment without starting the engine. Then she opened the glove compartment. The blue envelope was there. It had been there for 5 years since the afternoon after Grandma Lois's funeral, when Mara had found it tucked inside the cedar chest, beneath the old table linens tied with a piece of twine the color of rust. She had opened it once, read the first 2 lines, and closed it again because she had not been ready. She had put it in the glove compartment because she had not known where else to keep something she was not yet prepared to understand. She read it now. The handwriting was Grandma Lois's. Careful, deliberate, the letters formed the way a woman forms letters when she wants to make absolutely certain she is not misunderstood. Smoky Mountains. The cabin knows your name. When you are ready, go. Not before. But Mara, do not wait too long. Behind the note was an iron key, dark with age, heavier than it looked. And behind the key was a hand-drawn map on a folded piece of yellow legal paper. Past Gatlinburg. Left at the White Water Tower. 3rd Gravel Road, after the Pentecostal Church. Look for the mailbox with no name. Mara sat with the key in her palm for a long time. Then she started the car. She did not go to the mountains that day. She went to the house of a woman from her church named Margaret Coles, who had offered the back bedroom and fresh towels and the kind of quiet company that does not require explanation. Margaret made chamomile tea and left it on the nightstand and did not ask questions, and Mara lay in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the house on Harlow Street, the way you think about a place you built yourself and then lost. Not with grief exactly, with something older and harder than grief. With the particular exhaustion of a person who has been proven right about something terrible. She had known somewhere beneath all the years of not knowing that this was how it would end. She just had not known that Grandma Lois had seen it coming first. Lois Beaumont had been a woman of precise habits and imprecise affections. She had worked for 31 years as a bookkeeper for a commercial real estate firm in Savannah, and she had developed over those decades a particular talent for reading the difference between what numbers said and what they meant. She could look at a ledger and tell you not just what had happened, but why, and she could tell you which line items had been moved and who had moved them, and whether the person who had moved them thought anyone would notice. She noticed everything. She was 72 when Mara and Dennis bought the house on Harlow Street, and she had driven up from Savannah to see it. Dennis had shown her around with the smooth confidence he used on clients, pointing out the potential, the lot size, the neighborhood trajectory, the investment logic. Lois had listened without expression. Then she had followed Mara into the back garden, where the clay soil sat hard and pale under the February sun, and she had looked at her granddaughter and said quietly, "So Dennis would not hear, this house needs you more than it needs him. Make sure it remembers that." Mara had laughed. She had thought it was a grandmother's way of saying she approved. It was not. What Lois had seen that afternoon, what she had recognized, the way a bookkeeper recognizes a number that has been moved, was the architecture of a particular kind of marriage. She had seen it before in other forms in the ledgers of other men. The pattern where one person's contribution gets slowly reclassified, where labor becomes assistance, where vision becomes support, where a woman's name disappears from the record, one small revision at a time, until the record shows something that was never true. She had driven back to Savannah that Sunday evening and opened a new ledger. She titled it simply Mara. But Mara did not know any of this yet. What Mara knew in the winter of 1994 was that she had found the house on Harlow Street before Dennis had. She had been driving home from a client consultation she was working then as a junior associate at an interior design firm in Charleston, and she had taken a wrong turn on a street she didn't know and ended up on Harlow, and the house at the end of the block had stopped her. It was not beautiful. The porch sagged on the left side. The front windows were clouded with years of weather and neglect. The garden was a tangle of dead growth and old wire fencing. Someone had painted the shutters a color that had not been a good idea, even when it was new. But the bones were extraordinary. The roofline, the width of the front door, the way the second story sat above the first, with a kind of patient confidence, as if the house knew it had been built to last and was simply waiting for someone to remember that. Mara sat in her car in front of that house for 20 minutes before she called Dennis. He came the following Saturday. He walked through the rooms with the careful neutrality of a man performing an assessment, tapping walls, checking baseboards, opening cabinet doors that hung crooked on their hinges. In the kitchen, he looked at the water damage on the ceiling and shook his head slowly. In the back bedroom, he looked at the warped floor and did the calculation of what repair would cost against what the neighborhood could support. And the calculation did not work, and he said so. "This is a money pit, Mara, not a house." He was already moving toward the front door. Mara was standing in the kitchen, looking at the way the afternoon light came through the window above the sink. It came in at an angle that would only exist for about 40 minutes each day at that time of year, and it fell across the old tile in a pattern that was, despite everything, despite the water damage and the crooked cabinets and the decade of neglect, genuinely beautiful. Some houses do not impress you. They recognize you. She called Grandma Lois that night. She spread the inspection report across the kitchen table of their rental apartment and went through it line by line, the repair estimates beside it, the loan figures, the gap between what they had saved and what the down payment required. Lois listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, her grandmother asked one question. "Did it feel like yours?" Mara closed her eyes. She saw the light on the kitchen tile. She saw the roof line. She saw the east wing that nobody else had looked at carefully enough to see what it could become. "Yes," she said. "Then come by tomorrow." The next afternoon, Lois handed Mara an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check. Mara stared at it. "Grandma, I can't accept this." "You can," Lois said. "And you will. This is your savings. I don't know when I can pay it back. It is not a loan." Mara looked up. Lois's face was steady in the way it was steady when she had already decided something and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. "This is a gift to you," Lois said. "Not to Dennis, not to the marriage, to you. Keep that distinction clear." Mara almost smiled. She thought her grandmother was being protective in the way grandmothers are protective, warm, and a little dramatic and ultimately harmless. Lois did not smile back. "Keep records of what you give baby," she said, "and keep records of what you build. Love may be honest. Paper is not always kind." The following week, Mara drove Lois to the office of a notary public named Orville Beach, who worked out of a small office above a hardware store on the east side of Savannah. Mara had not arranged this appointment. Lois had. She presented documents that Mara had never seen: a gift letter, a statement of separate financial contribution, a declaration of intent. Orville Beach read each one carefully, asked 3 questions, and then affixed his seal. Mara signed where Lois told her to sign. She did not fully read what she was signing. She was 32 years old and in love with the house, and she trusted her grandmother completely, and so she signed. She would not understand what she had signed for another 30 years. They bought the house on Harlow Street in March of 1994. Dennis handled the closing documents because Dennis was, as he often pointed out, the one with the professional relationship to real estate transactions. He sat at the closing table with the easy authority of a man who understood the room, and the room responded to him. And Mara sat beside him and answered when she was addressed, and signed where she was told to sign, and by the end of the afternoon, the house was theirs. She did not know at that closing table that Dennis had already begun making adjustments. The early years were good. This is not a simple thing to say or to dismiss. There were mornings on the porch she had re-leveled when the light came through the magnolia tree at the end of the walk, and the neighborhood was still quiet, and Dennis brought coffee, and they sat together in the particular companionable silence of 2 people who have built something together and know it. There were dinners when the house felt exactly like what Mara had imagined when she stood in front of it on that winter afternoon and felt recognized. There were moments of genuine warmth and shared purpose and the ordinary happiness of a life being constructed. But even in the good years, if Mara had been watching carefully, and she was not watching carefully because she was busy building a house and a marriage and a career simultaneously, she would have seen the pattern beginning. It began with compliments. Dennis had a gift for praise that felt specific enough to be sincere. He would stand in a doorway of a room Mara had just finished and look at it with an expression of genuine appreciation and say something precise enough that she believed he had really seen it. "The way the light moves in here, the proportion of the trim to the window height, the color which is exactly right." He said these things and meant them, or seemed to, and Mara felt seen in the way that a person who works quietly and carefully and without much acknowledgement needs sometimes to feel seen. Then he learned to step in before she finished speaking. The transition was so gradual that Mara could not afterward identify the moment it began. She would start to explain a decision she had made about the house, the kitchen renovation, the drainage problem in the garden, the restoration of the original plaster ceiling in the front room. And Dennis would place his hand gently on her arm and finish the sentence in a way that was almost right, but was subtly, consistently his. We decided the original plaster was worth preserving. I had a feeling the east wing drainage was the real problem. That kitchen layout has been part of my thinking for a while. Small adjustments, each one individually forgivable, collectively over years a systematic replacement. Mara noticed and said nothing. This was the order of things in their marriage. She noticed and she considered whether it was worth the friction, and she decided it was not. And she filed it in the category of things that were true but not worth saying. She had a talent for this. Many women in long marriages develop a talent for this. It is not weakness. It is the arithmetic of daily life, the constant calculation of which truths are worth their cost. But the arithmetic was working against her in ways she could not yet see. Dennis's real estate business had grown steadily through the late 90s and into the early 2000s. He was good at his work, genuinely good, with an instinct for what a property could become and a salesman's ability to make other people see it too. But there was a gap between what he could see and what he could express. And Mara had always been the one to close that gap. She wrote the listing descriptions that made houses sound like invitations. She created the design boards that showed buyers not what a property was, but what it could feel like to live there. She built the visual language of his business in the spaces between her own work at kitchen tables and on weekend afternoons and late on Tuesday nights when the deadline was the following morning. Dennis presented all of it. The first time Mara understood this clearly was at a dinner Dennis hosted for two of his largest clients in the house she had built at a table she had set with rosemary from the garden she had planted. One of the clients looked around the dining room, the restored plaster ceiling, the light fixture Mara had found at an estate auction in Colombia, the arrangement of the table that made the room feel inhabited rather than displayed, and said to Dennis, "This is exactly the atmosphere you need to create in your listings. This feeling, whatever you're doing here." Dennis smiled. He was very good at smiling when the moment required it. "That's the philosophy I've been developing," he said. "Creating an emotional environment rather than simply presenting a physical space." Mara's hands stopped moving around the coffee pot. It was not the theft of the idea that stopped her. She had stopped being surprised by that. It was the word philosophy. He had taken a room she had built, and a table she had set, and a ceiling she had spent 6 weekends restoring by hand, and compressed them into a professional philosophy that belonged entirely to him. He had not simply accepted a compliment. He had converted her work into his intellectual property in front of her face and then poured it back at his clients as original thought. She carried the coffee pot back to the kitchen and stood at the sink for a moment. Then she came back and poured coffee and smiled. That sentence, the smile that followed the swallowed truth, became a habit, and habits maintained long enough become invisible, even to the person who developed them. The portfolio incident changed things, though Mara did not know it at the time. In the spring of 2012, Dennis was approached about a major commercial development project, a resort property outside Beaufort, a restoration of a historic coastal estate that would be converted into a boutique hotel and event venue. The contract was worth $40 million. The developer was looking for a real estate consultant with a specific kind of vision, someone who could understand not just the financial architecture of the deal, but the aesthetic identity of the property. Dennis wanted that contract badly enough that Mara could see it in him even when he tried not to show it. She spent 3 weeks building the presentation, not because Dennis asked her to. He had asked obliquely in the way he always asked, which was to describe the project over dinner in a voice full of creative excitement, and then go quiet in a way that meant he was waiting for her to offer. She offered because she always offered. She built the concept boards and the historical analysis and the design narrative and the vision statement. She worked from the character of the original estate, from photographs Dennis brought home, and architectural records she found at the County Historical Society, and her own understanding of how a building's past can be made to feel like an invitation to its future. Dennis presented it. He won the contract. In the summer of 2013, a real estate industry publication in Atlanta ran a profile of Dennis Calloway as one of the most innovative commercial property consultants in the Southeast. The profile included photographs of the concept boards. It described his visionary approach to historically grounded design. It quoted him at length on the philosophy of emotional architecture. Mara read the article at her kitchen table. Her coffee went cold. She read it 3 times, looking for her name. Not expecting it exactly, but looking. Her name was not there. That evening, she sat across from Dennis at dinner and said nothing about the article because she did not know how to say what needed to be said without it becoming something that would require them both to acknowledge what their marriage had actually become. And she was not ready for that acknowledgement. Not yet. So she passed the bread and talked about the garden and went to bed on her side of the room and stared at the ceiling she had restored until she was tired enough to sleep. Grandma Lois drove up from Savannah the following month. She was 82 by then, slower than she had been, but her eyes had not changed. She could still look at something and see the thing behind it. She found Mara at the dining room table, surrounded by Dennis's materials for a new listing. Photographs, design samples, copy notes. Mara was arranging them with the careful attention she gave everything, her hands moving through the pages with a kind of practiced efficiency. Lois stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the table, and then looked at her granddaughter. "Is your name on any of this?" she asked. Mara kept her eyes on the work. "It's for his business. That's not what I asked." Before Mara could answer, Dennis came through with his phone at his ear, kissed Mara on the cheek without looking at what she was doing, and smiled at Lois with the polished warmth he had developed over decades of professional charm. "Keeping her busy," he said. "She's a natural at this stuff. Loves having something useful to do." He was already moving toward his office. Lois watched him go. She watched the door close Then she opened her purse and placed an iron key on the table between the design samples and the copy notes. The key was tied with a piece of twine the color of rust. "There is a cabin in the Smoky Mountains," Lois said. "My name is the only name on that property. It will stay that way." Mara looked at the key, then at her grandmother. "Why are you giving me this?" Lois sat down across from her. Her voice was very quiet. "Because a woman needs one door in this world that no one else has the right to open." Mara wanted to say that Dennis would never do anything that required her to have a secret door. She looked at the key and then at the table covered with work that bore his name and not hers. And for the first time, the key did not feel dramatic. It felt like the kind of thing you take because you understand somewhere beneath the place where explanations live that you are going to need it. She put it in her pocket. 3 years later, Lois was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. She declined in the particular way of strong women, slowly at first, then faster than anyone expected, never quite willing to concede that her body had decided something her mind had not. Mara drove to Savannah every other weekend. She sat with Lois in the sunroom and they talked about the garden and the house and the family and the things that mattered and the things that did not. And sometimes they did not talk at all, just sat together in the comfortable silence of two people who have known each other long enough to share a quiet without filling it. In the spring of 2017, 2 years before she died, Lois asked Mara to drive her somewhere. She would not say where. She only said it was important and that she needed Mara with her. They drove to the office above the hardware store on the east side of Savannah. Orville Beach was 74 by then, his hair gone white, his hands steady. He greeted Lois with the recognition of a man who has kept a professional relationship for a long time and respected the person on the other side of it. They sat in his office. Lois produced documents. Mara was not asked to read them, was in fact gently redirected when she reached for them. Lois and Orville spoke quietly about things Mara caught only in pieces. The word affidavit. The phrase independently documented. The sentence, "and this is only to be transmitted in the event of a formal legal dispute regarding the property." Mara asked afterward what the appointment had been about. Lois looked out the window of the car and said, "Making sure you are protected." From what Mara asked. From the possibility Lois said that paper will one day try to tell a story about your life that you did not write. Mara drove home, not knowing what to make of that. She filed it in the same category as the key in the part of her mind where she kept the things that were true, but that she was not yet ready to fully understand. Lois died in April of 2019. She was 89 years old. She died in the sunroom of her house in Savannah on a morning when the light was coming through the windows in that particular way. It comes in coastal Georgia in spring, warm and full of the kind of clarity that does not apologize for what it illuminates. Mara sat with her until the end. Afterward, she found the blue envelope in the cedar chest, beneath the old table linens tied with rust-colored twine. She opened it, read 2 lines. closed it, put it in the glove compartment of her car because she was not ready, and she drove home to Charleston and to the house on Harlow Street and to the marriage that was by then held together primarily by habit and proximity, and the mutual reluctance to dismantle a life that had taken 30 years to construct. The divorce, when it came in the way that slow things come, with a speed that surprises you precisely because you thought you had been watching. Dennis had been seeing someone. Mara did not know this, and then she did, and the knowing did not break her the way she might have expected, because by the time she knew it, the marriage had already become something other than what she had believed it to be. What broke her, or rather what finally named the thing she had been carrying for years, was the attorney. Harlan Voss worked out of a narrow office near the historic district in Charleston, in a building that had survived several generations of storms and renovations and still smelled faintly of both. He was 55, deliberate, with the particular patience of a man who has spent decades listening to people describe situations they believed were unique and recognizing in every one of them the contours of a story he had heard before. He listened to Mara for an hour and 40 minutes without interruption. Then he opened the file he had been building since she first called his office and spread documents across his desk. He went through them carefully. The refinancing papers from 1998, the equity adjustment from 2002, the title modification from 2006. He placed each one in front of her and pointed to specific lines without speaking, and Mara looked at each one and began to understand with the particular nausea of understanding something you cannot then unknow what had been happening to her on paper while she had been busy happening in reality. She built this house, she said. I mean, I literally built it. I stripped the walls. I restored the plaster. I redesigned the east wing. I planted the garden. I paid for materials out of my own account for years. Harlan nodded. I believe you. Then he turned to the last document, the title adjustment from 2006. He placed it beside a signature card from a document Mara had signed in 2008. A routine banking update, something mundane and entirely hers. He pointed to the two signatures without speaking. Mara looked at them for a long moment. The signatures were not the same, not subtly different, fundamentally different. The letter formations, the angle of the pen pressure, the characteristic loop at the end of her first name, that she had written the same way since she was 20 years old. The signature on the 2006 document did not have that loop. It did not have her rhythm. It looked like someone had studied her signature carefully enough to approximate it, but had not known about the loop. That's not my signature, Mara said. Harlan said, I know. He was quiet for a moment. Mara, he said, this is not just a divorce case anymore. The court proceedings lasted 4 months. Richard's attorney, she still sometimes thought of Dennis with the wrong name in those months, as if she were confusing him with some other man who had made some other woman disappear, built a case from the record Dennis had spent years constructing. Primary income, documented mortgage payments, professional investment, and development. the architecture of a man who had provided for and maintained a property that happened to also have a wife attached to it. Harlan presented what he had: the design work, the renovation costs, the years of material purchases, the professional portfolio Dennis had used to win the Beaufort Resort contract. The court acknowledged the contributions in general terms. Then it awarded the house on Harlow Street to Dennis Calloway. Harlan touched her arm outside the courthouse. If we had clearer proof of the original family contribution and the extent of your independent investment, he said, this would have gone differently. The record they had was too thin. Mara nodded. She was very tired. She went back to Harlow Street and packed what the settlement allowed: 2 suitcases, the cedar chest, the photograph of Grandma Lois from the kitchen windowsill, her sketchbooks, which contained 30 years of design work that had no legal relevance to anything but that she was not leaving behind. In the kitchen, she opened the drawer beside the stove where she had kept Grandma Lois's first note, the one from 1994, the one that had said, "For the house that already knows your name." The drawer was empty. Not messy, not disturbed. Just empty in the deliberate way that things are empty when someone has removed something they did not want found. Dennis had been in that drawer at some point in the months before the divorce was final, while Mara was still sleeping in this house and eating in this kitchen and believing that the end would be complicated but survivable. Dennis had gone into that drawer and taken the note. Not the key. She had moved the key to the glove compartment years earlier. But the note was gone, and standing at that empty drawer in the kitchen of the house she had built, Mara understood something she had not understood before. Dennis had not started erasing her at the courthouse. He had been erasing her for 30 years. The courthouse had simply been the room where the erasure became official. She carried her things to the car. She placed the cedar chest in the trunk with the same care she had always given it. She got behind the wheel. She opened the glove compartment. The iron key was there. The blue envelope, the hand-drawn map on the yellow legal paper. She read the map again. Past Gatlinburg, left at the Whitewater Tower, 3rd gravel road after the Pentecostal church. Look for the mailbox with no name. She looked at the house on Harlow Street through the windshield. The magnolia tree, the porch she had re-leveled, the east wing whose load-bearing wall she had saved when no one else was paying attention, the front windows she had restored to clarity from years of weather and neglect, all of it behind a lock she no longer had the key to. But she had a different key. She had had it for 12 years. She had carried it through everything, through the portfolio incident, through the court proceedings, through the empty drawer, through all of it without fully understanding what it opened. She started the car. She drove to Margaret Coles's house and spent one night in the narrow back bedroom staring at an unfamiliar ceiling. In the morning, Margaret made coffee and said gently that Mara could stay as long as she needed. Mara thanked her. Then she packed her 2 suitcases back into the car and placed the cedar chest carefully in the trunk. Margaret stood at the door. "Are you sure about this?" Mara looked at the road, at the pale morning opening up over the low country. "No," she said, "but I think my grandmother was." She pulled out of Margaret's driveway and turned north. Behind her, the city of Charleston continued its morning. In front of her, the interstate stretched toward the mountains in the long, deliberate way that distances stretch in the American South, not hostile, not welcoming, simply there, waiting to be crossed. In the cup holder, the iron key caught the early light. Grandma Lois had been gone for 5 years. She had also, it turned out, been building something in her absence that Mara had not yet seen. But the Smoky Mountains were 300 miles away, and the cabin was at the end of a gravel road past a Pentecostal church. And whatever Grandma Lois had left beneath a floorboard in the kitchen of a property that existed in no record Dennis Calloway had ever touched, was waiting with the patience of something that has been waiting a long time and has no reason to stop. Mara drove north into the morning. The key rested in the cup holder, and the mountains somewhere ahead in the pale distance held what was coming next. The road to Gatlinburg does not announce itself. It begins as interstate wide and indifferent, the kind of road that carries everything and notices nothing. Then it narrows. The exits thin out. The billboards for outlet malls and pancake houses give way to tree lines and ridge shoulders, and the particular quality of light that exists only in the foothills of old mountains. Not dramatic, not romantic, just old. Genuinely old. The kind of old that makes the problems you brought with you feel briefly usefully small. Mara drove with both hands on the wheel and the iron key in the cup holder, and the blue envelope on the passenger seat, where another person might have sat. She had not eaten since the previous afternoon. She had not cried since the courthouse. She was not sure what she was saving the crying for, or whether she was saving it at all, or whether she had simply arrived at a place beyond it, where the grief had compressed itself into something harder and more useful than tears. She thought about Grandma Lois. She thought about the way Lois had looked at Dennis that afternoon in the dining room, the afternoon with the iron key. She had watched him leave the room, and then she had placed the key on the table between the design samples without drama, without a speech, with only the quiet certainty of a woman who has done her arithmetic and arrived at a number she does not like but cannot argue with. Mara had thought that afternoon that her grandmother was being protective in the way of old women who have seen enough of the world to distrust it. She had thought the key was a gesture, a symbol, the kind of thing you accept graciously and then carry around for years without needing. She had carried it for 12 years. She was beginning to understand that it had never been a symbol. Past Gatlinburg, the road thinned to 2 lanes, and the mountains closed in on both sides with the deliberate patience of things that have been standing in one place for a very long time. The trees were still bare from the tail end of winter. It was early March, cold and clear the sky, the particular blue that exists in the mountains before the season has fully decided what it intends to do. Mara drove carefully. She checked the map at every intersection, holding the yellow legal paper against the steering wheel at red lights, following the instructions in Lois's handwriting, the way she had once followed her grandmother's instructions for everything that mattered. Left at the white water tower. She found it. Third gravel road after the Pentecostal church. The church appeared around a long curve, small and white, with a hand-painted sign and a cemetery sloping behind it into the trees. Mara counted gravel roads. 1, 2, 3. She turned. The car climbed between walls of hemlock and white pine, the tires cracking over stone, the cell signal dropping bar by bar until the screen showed nothing. Branches brushed the mirrors. The light changed quality as it filtered through the canopy, coming down in thin, angled shafts that illuminated the dust her tires raised and then let it settle back into the silence. She had not been to this place before. She had not known it existed until the afternoon Lois handed her the key. She had not asked many questions because she had not been ready for the answers. And now she was driving towards something she had carried for 12 years without opening, and the road kept climbing, and the trees kept closing in. And somewhere ahead of her, a cabin was waiting that had her name on it in no record anyone had ever searched. The trees opened. The clearing was small, maybe a quarter acre ringed by hemlock on 3 sides, with the mountain falling away to the south, where the tree line dropped, and the view opened into a series of ridgelines receding in layers of blue and gray toward the horizon. The cabin sat in the center of the clearing, as if it had grown there rather than been built. Weathered cedar siding, a tin roof darkened by decades of rain and pine needles, a porch with one railing that had come loose on the left side and was leaning at an angle that suggested it had been meaning to address this for some time. It was not impressive. It was not meant to be. It was meant to be hidden, and it was, and that was worth more than impressive. Mara turned off the engine and sat for a moment. A creek ran somewhere behind the cabin. She could hear it water moving over stone in the unhurried way that mountain water moves, as if it has nowhere particular to be and is content to take the long way. The sound pulled at something in her that she could not name. Not memory exactly, something older than memory. She got out of the car. The mountain air was cold enough that her breath showed. The ground was soft with old needles and the particular damp of a place that rarely sees direct sun for long. She stood in the clearing and looked at the cabin and felt for the first time in months that she was somewhere no one was looking for her. Not Dennis, not the court, not the version of herself that had spent 30 years making other people's spaces feel inhabited. She crossed the clearing and climbed the porch steps. The boards held. She found the lock, old iron dark with age, the same vintage as the key in her hand, and fitted the key into it. It resisted for a moment the resistance of something that has been still for a long time and is not certain it wants to move. Then it gave. The door swung inward on a long, tired sound, and the smell of the cabin came out to meet her. Cedar, cold ash, old wood, and beneath those, something fainter lavender, or the memory of lavender caught in the grain of old timber. Like a word that has been said so many times, it has become part of the walls. She stepped inside. One room mostly, a stone fireplace on the north wall with cold ash in the grate, a narrow bed against the far wall with a quilt folded at the foot of it, a rocking chair near the east window, shelves along the south wall lined with mason jars and folded cloth and candles in various states of use. And there beneath the south-facing window, where the view dropped away toward the ridgelines, Grandma Lois's kitchen table. Plain wood, scarred surface, 2 chairs. Mara crossed to it and placed both palms flat on the wood. It was cold from the mountain air. She stood there for a moment with her hands on the table, and the silence of the cabin settling around her, like something that had been waiting to do exactly this. Then she looked down. The floorboards ran unevenly across the room, the boards of different widths, the gaps between them irregular in the way of old construction that was not trying to be perfect, but was trying to last. Most of them were tight. One was not. Third board from the left beneath the kitchen table. She had heard those words once years ago in Lois's sunroom in Savannah on an afternoon when she had been too frightened to ask what they meant. She had filed them in the place where she kept things she was not ready to understand. She was ready now. She lowered herself to the floor, her knees pressed into the old wood. She found the edge of the board with her fingertips. It lifted without resistance, as if it had been designed to, as if Lois had left it exactly this loose for exactly this purpose. Beneath it was a shallow space lined with old newspaper, the paper yellowed and brittle, the headlines from a world that no longer existed. And inside that space wrapped in oilcloth was a locked tin box. Mara sat back on her heels and looked at it. The iron key was already in her hand. She had used it on the cabin door. She fitted it now into the lock on the tin box, and the lock opened with a small sound, a click, a release that seemed too small for what it was unlocking. She lifted the lid. Inside was a blue folder, faded at the corners, tied with white string. Across the front in Lois's handwriting, careful, deliberate the letters formed by a woman who wanted to be understood, were 7 words. For the house they may try to take. Mara's hands went still. She untied the string. The first page was a letter. The handwriting was slower than she remembered from Lois's best years. The letters formed with more effort, but the precision was still there. The intention was still there. Lois had written this, knowing exactly what she was writing and why. My Mara, if you are reading this, someone has tried to make you believe that the life you built can be taken because your name was not placed where it should have been. I could not make you see Dennis Calloway for what he was before you were ready to see him. A woman has to arrive at that knowledge in her own time, and I understood that. and I chose to respect it. But I did not choose to leave you unprotected. I kept records. I kept proof. I kept something safe for the day when memory alone would not be enough to defend what you built. Mara lowered the page. Memory alone would not be enough. That was precisely what the court had taught her. Harlan had believed her. Harlan had seen the truth of what she was describing, and belief had not been sufficient because belief without documentation is just a story, and the room had been full of better documented stories. She opened the folder wider. The first document was a copy of the cashier's check Lois had written in 1994. The memo line was clear and specific in the way that a bookkeeper's memo lines are always clear and specific because a bookkeeper knows that memo lines are where the truth goes when everything else is ambiguous. Gift to Mara Calloway for purchase of residence at Harlow Street, Charleston, SC. Separate family contribution, not marital property. Mara read it twice, then a third time. For months, Dennis's version of the house had carried the weight of official documentation. It had sat in the courthouse like a fact. And now, here in an oilcloth-wrapped tin box beneath a floorboard in the Smoky Mountains, was a bank stamp that said something different. She turned to the next document, and the next. Transfer records. Copies of deposit slips from Mara's personal account, not the joint account, but the account she had maintained separately through the early years of the marriage, the one she had used to buy materials when Dennis said the budget was tight, the one she had slowly drained through renovation after renovation, without ever tallying what she had spent. Because she had not been thinking about documentation, she had been thinking about the house. Lois had been thinking about documentation. Every deposit, every withdrawal that matched a purchase. Every receipt that Mara had not known anyone was keeping. Then she turned to the ledger. It was a composition notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, the kind that costs $1 at any drugstore in America. Lois had filled it in her small, precise bookkeeper's hand, date by date, transaction by transaction, entry by entry. The first entry was dated March 1996, 2 years into the marriage, 2 years into the house. Not the beginning, but the beginning of the record. March 14th, 1996. Dennis Calloway presents listing materials at Coastal Properties Conference, Charleston. Materials include design boards, concept language, and visual identity created by Mara Calloway. Mara's name not included in presentation materials. Witnessed by self. April 3rd, 1996. Invoice from Harlow Street renovation contractor, redirected from Mara Calloway personal account to Dennis Calloway business account at Dennis's request. Original materials purchased by Mara. Documentation attached. Entry after entry. Year after year. Lois had maintained this ledger through the late 90s, through the 2000s, through the decade, when Mara had been building the house and building Dennis's business and building the life they shared. And through all of that building, Lois had been in Savannah, keeping a parallel record with the patience and precision of a woman who had spent 31 years watching numbers tell the truth about people who believed they were hiding. The ledger ran to 2017, the year Lois had taken Mara to Orville Beach's office. The last entry read, "Affidavit completed and notarized. All supplementary documentation delivered to O Beach for secure keeping. This ledger to be placed in Cabin Smoky Mountains property for Mara's retrieval. My part is done. The rest is hers." Mara set the ledger down on Lois's kitchen table and pressed both palms flat against the wood again. She was not crying yet. She would cry, but not yet. Right now she was reading, and the reading required her to stay present. There were photographs. She had not expected photographs. They were in a manila envelope at the back of the folder, labeled in Lois's hand, "Visual Documentation, Harlow Street Property, 1994 to 2013. Mara opened the envelope and spread them across the table. There she was, younger. Her hair pulled back, wearing the old jeans she had painted the front bedroom in during the first summer. Standing beside a stack of reclaimed floorboards in the back garden, with her hand resting on the top board in the proprietary way of someone who has just selected every one of them by hand. Kneeling in the kitchen with tile samples spread around her on the floor she had not yet refinished. Standing in the east wing with the blueprint in her hands and the exposed frame of the load-bearing wall behind her, the mistake visible in the distance, the correction already marked in her handwriting on the paper she held. On the back of this last photograph in Lois's handwriting, "This is the day she saved the east wing. The contractor said the original plan was fine." Mara knew it wasn't. The engineer confirmed she was right 3 days later. She never mentioned it again. And then the one that broke her. It was a photograph Mara had not known existed. It must have been taken through the kitchen window. The angle was wrong for anyone standing in the room. It showed Mara at the kitchen table late at night. The light from the overhead fixture making a small bright circle in the dark house. Papers spread around her, her head bent over the work. It was the kind of photograph that could only have been taken by someone who was watching, who had been watching long enough to know that this was what happened after Dennis went to bed, that this was where the work got done, that this was the unseen engine of everything Dennis presented as his own. On the back, Lois had written, "She works when the house is quiet. He presents when the room is full. The record should know the difference." Mara put the photograph face down on the table. She put both hands over her face, and then she cried. Not loudly, and not beautifully, and not in the way that crying looks in films. She cried the way people cry when they have been holding something for a very long time in a very small space, and the space finally runs out in the deep, exhausted, shoulder-shaking way of genuine release. The tears coming not from sadness alone, but from the complex grief of being finally, completely seen by someone who was no longer there to see her. She cried because Lois had believed her before there was a case. She cried because the house had not been imagined. She cried because her grandmother had spent 21 years keeping a record in a composition notebook so that the truth would have somewhere to live, even if Mara could not protect it herself. She cried because Lois was gone and had left this behind as the most precise and generous expression of love that Mara had ever received, and she had not known, and now she knew, and knowing was the thing that finally broke through everything she had been holding since the courthouse. She cried until she was empty. Then she wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater and picked up her phone. No signal. The screen showed nothing, not one bar. She almost laughed. Of course. She gathered every page with both hands and returned them carefully to the blue folder. Then she carried the folder to the car, placed it on the passenger seat, and drove back down the gravel road toward the main road and the Pentecostal church and the white water tower and the 2 bars of cell signal she had noticed near the Gatlinburg turnoff. She called Harlan Voss. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Harlan," she said. "I found something." "What kind of something?" She looked at the folder on the seat beside her. She thought about how to describe what was in it. Then she decided that description was not what this moment required. "I'm going to read you some of what's here," she said, "and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." He listened. She read him the memo line on the cashier's check. She described the ledger, the dates, the entries, the 21 years of parallel documentation. She described the photographs, including the one taken through the kitchen window. She told him about Orville Beach and the appointment in 2017 and the affidavit she had never been allowed to read. When she finished, the line was quiet for long enough that she checked to make sure the call had not dropped. Then Harlan said, "Read me the date on the first ledger entry again." "March 1996, she said, "and the last entry September 2017. He was quiet again. "Mara," he said carefully, "your grandmother built you a case. A real one. The kind that doesn't depend on your word against his. I know." "No," he said. "I don't think you understand yet what I mean." He paused. "A personal gift with a dated bank instrument and a notarized statement of separate contribution, combined with a contemporaneous ledger documenting misattribution of your work and independent material purchases, that's not supplementary evidence. That's a foundation. That changes the conversation we're able to have." "What conversation?" He said, "The one where Dennis Calloway has to answer questions he was never expecting to be asked." He gave her instructions in the precise, unhurried way he gave all instructions. "Do not contact Dennis. Do not contact his attorney. Do not discuss the folder with anyone connected to Harlow Street. Photograph every page before anything else. Make 2 sets of copies, one to send to his office, one to keep at the cabin. Do not let the originals leave your possession." "And Mara," he said before they hung up, "the forgery finding from the 2006 document I've been waiting on the handwriting analyst's formal report. Given what you've just described, I want to move that to the top of the list. If the ledger documents the pattern of misattribution across those years, and we can place a forged signature in the middle of it, We're not talking about a civil dispute anymore. We're talking about a pattern of deliberate fraud. Mara sat in her car on the shoulder of the road outside Gatlinburg, with the mountains around her, and the folder on the passenger seat, and the afternoon light going gold through the windshield. "All right," she said. She drove into town and found a copy shop on the main street, a small place with 2 machines and a teenager behind the counter who handled the pages with careful indifference and did not ask what they were. The scanner light passed over the cashier's check, over the first page of the ledger, over the photograph of Mara at the kitchen table late at night. When the copies were done, she drove back to the cabin. She spread the duplicates across Lois's kitchen table and opened the composition notebook to the first page. Then she opened her own notebook, a fresh one she had bought at a gas station on the way to Margaret's house because she had known she would need somewhere to write things down, and she began to work. She started with the ledger. She cross-referenced the dates with her own memory, filling in the details that Lois's entries had noted, without explaining the context, the conversations, the specific circumstances under which each piece of work had been taken. Some of it she remembered clearly. Some of it she had to reconstruct from the edges of memory, from the feeling of a particular evening, or the ghost of a particular conversation. But the dates were Lois's, and the dates were solid, and having solid dates was like having a spine to build around. Then she started calling the names in the back of the folder. Lois had left a list: 12 names, phone numbers, addresses. Contractors, a former closing assistant, a neighbor from Harlow Street, a retired colleague from Dennis's office. At the top of the list in Lois's handwriting, people who saw what you did. Not all of them will remember, but enough of them will. The first call she made was to Cleet Dornbach. She remembered Cleet from the early years, a broad, quiet man with a contractor's economy of words and a craftsman's memory for the specifics of a job. He had worked on the Harlow Street renovation in 3 phases over the first 5 years: the kitchen, the east wing, and the porch. He had not been easy to work with, not because he was difficult, but because he had standards that required other people to have standards too. And not everyone who hired him was willing to meet that requirement. Mara had met it. She had shown up every day. She had known the measurements. She had changed the load-bearing wall plan with a clarity and a confidence that had surprised him, not because women didn't do that, but because most of the people who hired him didn't do that, regardless of gender. They hired and delegated and appeared for the final reveal. Mara had been in the work every day it was happening. He remembered her. "Your husband came by once a month or so," Cleet said, usually with someone he was trying to impress. He'd walk through like he'd been there the whole time. Mara wrote in her notebook. "He asked me once to put the final invoice under his name instead of yours," Cleet said. Said it kept things cleaner for his business accounting. "I thought it was strange, but I did it because he was paying the bill. I didn't know it mattered." He paused. "I've got the job diaries, though. I keep them for everything. Every change order, every site decision, every time someone tells me to do something different from the original plan. Your signature is on every change that got made to that east wing." Mara stopped writing. "Can you find those?" she asked. "Already looking." he said. The second call she made was to Wendell Pruitt. Wendell had lived next door to Harlow Street for the entire 25 years Mara and Dennis had owned the house. He was a retired civil engineer, methodical, the kind of man who documented things not because he expected to need the documentation, but because documentation was simply what careful people did. He had installed a camera system on his property in 2008, not for any specific reason, he said, just because it seemed like a reasonable thing to do, and he had never deleted the archived footage. I figured out how to back it up to a drive about 6 years ago, Wendell said. So I've got everything from 2012 on. He had looked through some of it after Mara called, he said. He had not needed to look for long. You were out front a lot, he said. Working in the garden on the porch, directing deliveries. Your husband came and went. Nothing unusual about that. People work different hours. But there's something here I want you to know about. He told her about the night in 2019. Mara had been in Savannah. Lois was in the hospital. Dennis had brought a man to the house middle of the evening, maybe 8 o'clock. Someone Wendell didn't recognize. Someone who carried a briefcase and walked through the front door with the purposeful manner of a person conducting business rather than paying a social call. They were inside for about 90 minutes, Wendell said. Then they left. Separately. Mara sat with that for a moment. She thought about what kind of business a man conducts in his house at 8 in the evening, while his wife is sitting in a hospital room with her dying grandmother. She thought about the equity adjustment. She thought about the conversation Harlan had described the internal document about using Harlow Street as collateral signed before the divorce was final. Wendell, she said, would you be willing to share that footage? Already making copies, he said. Same as you should be doing with whatever you found up there. She called 3 more names from the list that evening. A former closing assistant named Brenda Falk, who had worked at the title company in 1994, and remembered the transaction. Clearly remembered specifically that the down payment had come from a cashier's check made out to Mara alone, and that the closing attorney had noted it as a separate family contribution. A retired bookkeeper named Carl Hutchins, who had worked for Dennis's real estate firm for 8 years, and had in that time noticed discrepancies between the materials Dennis submitted for industry awards and the credited sources on those materials. And a woman named Sylvia Brandt, who had attended several open houses Dennis had hosted at Harlow Street, and who said without being asked that she had always assumed Mara was the one who designed the interiors because the design was too specific and too considered to have come from someone who wasn't living inside the thinking of the house. I asked Dennis once who designed the kitchen, Sylvia said. He said it was a collaborative process. He said it like that meant something. I always thought it meant he hadn't done it. Mara wrote everything down. Dates, names, what they saw, what they had, what they were willing to say on the record. She was halfway through transferring her notes to a clean page when the headlights appeared. She saw them through the south-facing window, the window that looked out toward the clearing, and the tree line where the gravel road emerged. One vehicle. moving slowly, too slowly for someone who had taken a wrong turn, too slowly for someone who was simply passing. The headlights stopped at the edge of the clearing. Mara did not move. She did not turn off the cabin light because turning it off would tell him she had seen him, and she did not want him to know what she had seen. She sat at Lois's kitchen table with the blue folder open in front of her and her notebook beside it, and she watched through the window. Dennis stepped out of the vehicle. He stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cabin with the particular expression he wore when he was assessing a property. Not the expression he showed clients, the warm and animated performance of a man who sees possibility, but the private expression, the one she had seen in the early mornings of their marriage. When he stood in the doorway of a room he was calculating, measuring, determining what it was worth and what it would cost and what it could be made to yield. He was not there to apologize. He was not there to negotiate. He was there to measure the threat. Mara understood this with the clarity that comes from 30 years of reading a person. She understood it not with her mind, but with the part of her that had been reading him since 1994. The part that had noticed and said nothing and filed it away and kept on building. That part of her understood exactly what his presence at the edge of that clearing meant. He knew she had found something. He did not know what. He had come to look at the cabin the way you look at a locked safe when you don't have the combination, not because looking tells you what's inside, but because standing in front of it lets you feel the dimensions of what you're dealing with. He stood there for 4 minutes. She counted. Then he got back in the vehicle and drove away down the gravel road, his headlights sweeping across the tree line and then disappearing into the dark. Only then did Mara breathe. She picked up her phone and called Harlan. "He's here," she said. "Was here. He just left." Harlan was quiet for a moment. Did he come to the door? No. He stood at the edge of the property and looked. Then he left. Another pause. "Good," Harlan said. "That means he already knows enough to be scared. And scared men make mistakes." She asked how he could have found out so quickly. She had only begun calling people that day. Harlan had not contacted Dennis's attorney yet. Harlan said, "Think about who you called." Mara went through the list. Cleet Dornbach, Wendell Pruitt, Brenda Falk, Carl Hutchins, Sylvia Brandt. "Carl Hutchins," she said. "He worked for Dennis," retired Harlan said. But people in small professional communities talk. It doesn't take much. A phone call from a number Dennis recognizes as connected to you. Word gets back. That's not a problem. That's information. If he drove 3 hours into the mountains to look at a cabin, the documents in that folder are worth more than he told his attorney. Mara looked at the blue folder on the table. At Lois's kitchen table, which had waited in this cabin for 5 years, with the patience of something built by a woman who understood that some truths could not be rushed. "What do we do now?" she asked. Harlan said, "We let him wonder." She hung up and sat for a long time in the quiet of the cabin. The creek ran behind the building water over stone, unhurried and indifferent to the calculations happening inside. The folder sat open in front of her, the notebook beside it full of names and dates, and the recorded memory of people who had seen what she had done and had simply been waiting without knowing they were waiting to be asked. Mara looked at the photograph of Lois she had propped against the mason jars on the south shelf. It was the photograph from the kitchen windowsill at Harlow Street. Lois, in her 70s, still sharp looking at the camera, with the expression of a woman who is tolerating having her picture taken because the person taking it loves her and she loves them back, and some things are worth tolerating. She had carried that photograph out of Harlow Street in her arms the day the settlement was finalized. She had carried it the way you carry something you are not leaving behind, regardless of what the paperwork says. She had also, without fully understanding it at the time, carried everything Lois had spent 21 years preparing. The cabin was quiet. The mountains were dark. The folder sat open on the table, and the names in the notebook were real, and the handwriting in the ledger was her grandmother's. And Harlan Voss was 300 miles away, preparing questions that Dennis Calloway was not going to want to answer on the record. Mara closed the folder. She placed her hands flat on the cover over the 7 words Lois had written there. For the house they may try to take. Outside, the Smoky Mountains held the dark, the way they had always held it, without effort, without drama, with the simple authority of something that has been standing in one place long enough to know that most things pass and some things don't. Mara was not passing. She was just getting started. The demand letter went out on a Tuesday morning. Harlan Voss sent it from his office in Charleston on paper that carried no drama and required none. It was 4 pages single-spaced, written in the measured language of a man who has spent 3 decades learning that the most powerful documents are the ones that do not raise their voice. There were no accusations in it. There were no emotional appeals. There was no language that could be dismissed as the complaint of a bitter woman working through a difficult divorce. There were only questions, 6 of them. Why had the separate family gift documented in the 1994 cashier's check made payable to Mara Calloway alone, accompanied by a notarized statement of independent contribution, not been disclosed in the original divorce proceedings? Why had renovation expenses independently documented as purchased from Mara Calloway's personal account been recorded under Dennis Calloway's name in the property's financial history? Why did the signature on the 2006 title adjustment not match Mara Calloway's authenticated signature on any other legal document from the preceding or following decade? Why had Dennis Calloway contacted Mara Calloway by phone within 48 hours of her beginning to gather records before any formal legal communication had been initiated? Why had Dennis Calloway appeared in person at a private property in Sevier County, Tennessee, a property not listed in any shared marital record and not known to him through any disclosed channel within 72 hours of Mara Calloway's arrival there? And finally, what was the nature of the meeting that took place at the Harlow Street property on the evening of April 14th, 2019, while Mara Calloway was in Savannah, Georgia, attending to her dying grandmother, A meeting documented in security footage from an adjacent property and attended by an unidentified individual who arrived and departed separately. 6 questions, each one with something solid standing behind it. Harlan had told Mara that morning before he sent it. This letter is not designed to win anything today. It is designed to show Dennis Calloway's attorney that we are not operating on sentiment, that we have documentation, that we have witnesses, that we have a forensic handwriting analysis pending on a potentially fraudulent signature, and that we have footage of a meeting that took place in the marital home during a period when his client was supposed to have clean hands. What happens after they read it, he said, will tell us everything we need to know about how worried they are. Mara had asked how long until they respond. Harlan had said, if they're not worried, 2 weeks. If they are sooner. Dennis's attorney called on day 11. Mara was sitting on the cabin porch when Harlan called her with the news. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of March morning in the mountains that feels like an argument against everything that happened in winter. The sky, a hard, clean blue. The hemlocks still dark against it. The creek audible from the porch in the particular way that mountain water is audible in cold air. She had been drinking coffee and working through a legal pad of notes she had been building since the night Dennis's headlights had swept across the tree line. Harlan said they called this morning. His attorney's tone was different from our last conversation. How different? He said the last time I spoke with Jerome Watts, he described your claims as emotionally motivated and legally unsupported. This morning, he asked how quickly we could arrange an informal meeting. Mara looked out at the clearing, at the place where the headlights had stopped 11 days ago. What changed? She asked. Harlan said, I think several things changed. But I think the question about the 2019 meeting changed it most. That question tells them we have footage they didn't know existed. And footage of an undisclosed meeting in the marital home conducted while you were out of state and held before the divorce proceedings concluded is the kind of thing that raises questions beyond the civil matter. It raises questions about what was being arranged and who was being brought in to arrange it. He paused. Jerome Watts is a careful attorney, Harlan said. Careful attorneys don't like questions they can't answer. And right now, he has at least 2 he can't answer cleanly. The second question, Mara said. The forgery, Harlan confirmed. The handwriting analyst's formal report came back yesterday. The signature on the 2006 title adjustment is, in the analyst's professional opinion, not Mara Calloway's signature. The deviation is not within the range of natural variation. It is consistent with deliberate imitation by a third party. That is a criminal matter, Mara. Jerome Watts knows that. Dennis knows it, and they know that we know it. Mara sat with her coffee going cold in her hand. She had known this was coming. She had known it since the afternoon in Harlan's office when he had placed the 2 signatures side by side, and she had seen immediately that one of them was not hers. Knowing something and hearing it confirmed in formal language are different experiences, though. The confirmation landed differently. It landed with a particular weight. of a thing that has been true for a long time, finally being acknowledged by a process that takes truth seriously. "What do we do?" she asked. Harlan said we agreed to the meeting, on our terms, in our timeline, and we bring everything. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks later, in a conference room on the 12th floor of a building in downtown Charleston that looked out over the harbor. Harlan had insisted on the location-neutral ground, his territory, more than Dennis's, a room that neither of them owned. Mara drove down from the mountains the night before. She stayed in a hotel near the historic district in a room with a window that looked out over a courtyard full of old camellias just beginning to bloom. She ordered room service and ate at the small table by the window and went through her notes one more time. Not because she needed to, she had been through them enough times that the structure of the case was as familiar to her as a floor plan, but because the discipline of reviewing them settled something in her that needed settling before the morning. She was not afraid. She understood that this surprised her, and she sat with that surprise for a while and examined it honestly. She had expected to be afraid. She had been afraid at various points in the preceding weeks. Afraid in the courthouse, afraid in Margaret's back bedroom, afraid the night Dennis's headlights swept across the clearing. And she had understood that he had found the cabin. She had been afraid in the way of a person who has spent 30 years in a particular arrangement of the world and suddenly finds that arrangement dissolving. But she was not afraid now. What she felt now was something she did not have an immediate word for. It was the feeling of a person who has done the work, all of the work, not just the recent work, but the 30 years of work that preceded it, and who is walking into a room where the work is finally going to be acknowledged. Not celebrated, not applauded, simply acknowledged by a process that required acknowledgement before it could proceed. She slept well for the first time in months. In the morning, she dressed carefully. Not for Dennis, not to perform anything. She dressed the way she dressed when she was going to meet a client for the first time on a significant project, with the quiet attention of a person who respects the work enough to show up for it properly. She met Harlan in the lobby at 1 o'clock. He was carrying the blue folder in a document case. He had made his own copies and organized them into a presentation structure. But he had kept the originals in Lois's folder because he understood without being told that the originals mattered in a way that copies did not. They were the thing itself. They carried the physical reality of 21 years of careful preparation. They rode the elevator to the 12th floor. The conference room had glass walls on 2 sides. The harbor was visible to the south gray-green and busy with the mid-afternoon traffic of a working port. The table was long and polished to the kind of smoothness that reflects the hands placed on it. Dennis was already there when they entered, seated on the far side of the table, with Jerome Watts beside him and a paralegal at the end. Dennis was wearing the Navy suit. Of course he was. He had worn it to the courthouse. He wore it to every room that mattered, as if the suit itself were an argument. His hair was precisely arranged. His posture was controlled. He looked from the doorway like the version of himself he had been presenting to professional rooms for 30 years. but he did not fill the room before he entered it. That was the difference. The quality that Mara had always noticed in Dennis, the way his confidence preceded him into a space, the way a room seemed to rearrange itself slightly around his arrival. That quality was absent. He was present. He was composed. But he was contained inside himself in a way he had not been before, and the containment was visible to anyone who knew what his unconstricted version looked like. Mara knew. She sat down across from him and looked at him directly, and he looked back at her, and for a moment the room was simply two people who had known each other for 30 years, looking at each other across a table. Then Jerome Watts began to speak. He called the situation unfortunate. He called the original proceedings thorough and fairly conducted. He said that new information, while potentially relevant, needed to be considered in the context of a settlement that had already been reached and agreed upon by both parties. He used the word finality several times in the particular way that attorneys use words they want to sound like legal principles, even when they are simply preferences. Harlan listened without expression. Mara listened without expression. When Watts finished, Harlan opened the document case. He placed the cashier's check on the table first. The copy but clear enough that the memo line was legible from where Dennis sat gift to Mara Calloway for purchase of residence at Harlow Street, Charleston, SC. Separate family contribution, not marital property. Dennis looked at it. His expression did not change. Harlan placed the notarized statement beside it. Lois's signature at the bottom, Orville Beach's seal beside it, dated March 1994. The statement that said in the careful language of a woman who had thought carefully about every word the funds provided to my granddaughter Mara Calloway are a personal family gift intended solely for her contribution toward the purchase and protection of the property known as Harlow Street, and are not to be considered marital property under any subsequent legal proceeding. Dennis's jaw moved slightly. Not much. Enough. The ledger came next. Harlan did not open it. He simply placed it on the table. The black and white composition notebook, 21 years of entries in Lois Beaumont's bookkeeper's hand. He let it sit there. Then the handwriting analyst's report. Harlan slid it across the table to Jerome Watts and waited while Watts read the first page. Mara watched Watts's face as he read. She saw the moment he reached the formal conclusion, the professional opinion that the signature on the 2006 title adjustment was not Mara Calloway's signature, that it was consistent with deliberate imitation by a third party. Watts' expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. The subtle recalibration of a man who has just read something that changes the shape of the room. Then the job diaries from Cleet Dornbach. Bound copies every page Mara's signature on every change order for the East Wing renovation, the kitchen phase, the porch work. 31 separate authorizations in her handwriting on documents that had been sitting in Cleet's storage for 2 decades. Wendell Pruitt's footage summarized in a written account with timestamps. Mara's presence at the property documented across hundreds of individual days. The April 14, 2019 meeting noted with specificity duration, separate arrivals, the briefcase, the manner of departure. And finally, Harlan placed the internal document on the table. the one Dennis's own attorney had accidentally included in their response to the demand letter. The meeting notes referencing the plan to use Harlow Street's equity as collateral for a new business arrangement executed before the divorce was finalized. Watt saw it and went very still in the way of someone who has just understood the full dimension of an error. Dennis looked at each document as it was placed in front of him. He looked at them the way a man looks at the evidence of his own life when the evidence has been organized by someone other than himself, and the organization reveals a pattern he believed was invisible. Harlan said, "We are prepared to discuss a resolution that addresses the full scope of what this documentation establishes. That scope includes the undisclosed separate family contribution, the documented independent investment by Mara Calloway in the acquisition and restoration of the property, the misattribution of professional work product over a period of more than 2 decades, the question of the 2006 signature and the equity transaction conducted in violation of the standing court order." He let the list sit in the air of the room for a moment. "We are also prepared," Harlan said, "to refer the signature matter to the appropriate authorities if this conversation does not result in an adequate resolution. That decision has not yet been made. It is, however, available to us." Jerome Watts murmured something to Dennis. Dennis did not respond. He was still looking at the documents on the table. Mara spoke then. She had not planned to speak first. She had told herself she would let Harlan run the room, that she would be the still point in the center of the professional machinery. But she looked at Dennis across the table, and she understood that there was something she needed to say that Harlan could not say for her, and the time to say it was now before the negotiation began, while the room still held the full weight of everything that had been placed on the table. She said, "I'm not here to take back the house, Dennis." He looked at her. For the first time since she had entered the room, he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the early years, with the full attention of a man who is not performing anything, who is simply looking. "I love that house," she said. "I built most of what made it worth loving. You know that. I have known for a long time that you know that, and I have known for a long time that you counted on me not being able to prove it." She placed her hand flat on the table. Not aggressive, simply present. "I can prove it now, and what I want is not the house. What I want is for the record to tell the truth. Not my version of the truth. Not a version that makes you the villain of a story. The truth. What happened. What I contributed. What that contribution was worth. I want that in the legal record because it belongs there, and because my grandmother spent 21 years making sure it would be available to put there, and I am not going to let that go to waste." The room was quiet. Outside the glass walls, the harbor moved in the gray-green way of working water that does not pause for the negotiations of people on the 12th floor. Dennis looked at his attorney. Then he looked back at Mara. He did not speak, but something in the architecture of his posture, the careful maintained structure of a man who had spent 30 years presenting himself as the primary author of his own success, shifted in a way that could not be restored. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who had not been watching him for decades. But Mara had been watching him for decades. She saw it. The first offer from Watts came 40 minutes into the negotiation. It was low generous compared to the original settlement, but low relative to what the documentation supported. Harlan declined it without drama by placing his pen on the table and waiting. The second offer was better. Harlan looked at Mara. She looked at the harbor. She thought about the porch she had re-leveled, the east wing she had saved, the kitchen light she had spent 3 weeks getting right because the warmth of a room at 8 in the evening is not a small thing. It is the thing that makes a house feel like a home rather than a structure, and that distinction is the work of someone who understands what a home is for. She shook her head. The room recalibrated. Watts spoke to Dennis quietly. Dennis said something Mara could not hear. Watts turned back to the table. It was then that Harlan's phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Something in his expression shifted, not alarm, not excitement, something quieter and more significant than either. He said, "Excuse me," and answered it, and the room waited in the particular suspended way of rooms waiting for a call to resolve. Harlan listened. He said yes twice, and then he said, "Please send it to my secure email," and then he ended the call and placed the phone on the table and looked at Mara. He said that was Orville Beach. The name arrived in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Mara felt the ripple of it move through her. Orville Beach was 81 years old. He had worked as a notary public in Savannah, Georgia, for 53 years, operating out of the same office above the same hardware store on the east side of the city. He had notarized more than 12,000 documents in that time. He had a filing system that his daughter called obsessive, and that he called professional, and in that filing system, maintained across 53 years in a series of fireproof cabinets that had survived 2 hurricanes and 1 significant flood, he kept copies of every document he had ever certified, including the 1994 gift letter and notarized statement for the Harlow Street purchase, including the 2017 affidavit that Lois Beaumont had asked him to hold, the one Mara had never been allowed to read, the one she had watched her grandmother produce in that small office while Orville asked his careful questions and applied his careful seal, and including Harlan now, said a supplementary document that had been prepared at the same 2017 appointment. A document that had not been placed in the cabin folder, had not been mentioned to Mara, and had been held by Orville Beach under specific instructions from Lois Beaumont that it was to be transmitted only in the event of a formal legal dispute regarding the Harlow Street property. Orville had seen the demand letter. A copy had reached him through a former colleague who knew of his connection to the case. He had waited to see whether the dispute would resolve informally. When it had not, he had picked up the phone that morning. The supplementary document was a sworn declaration, Harlan said. Signed by Lois Beaumont in September of 2017, notarized by Orville Beach, witnessed by 2 individuals whose signatures and contact information were included. In it, Lois had provided a detailed accounting line by line, year by year, with supporting reference to the ledger she had maintained of every independent financial and creative contribution Mara Calloway had made to the Harlow Street property from 1994 through 2017. She had included her professional assessment as a person with 31 years of experience in commercial real estate bookkeeping of the total value those contributions represented. She had stated clearly and under oath that the property's current market value was substantially attributable to work performed, financed, and directed by Mara Calloway. And she had concluded with a single sentence that she had apparently composed with the same deliberateness she brought to every document that mattered. Harlan read it aloud. It is my professional and personal judgment that Mara Calloway is the primary author of the Harlow Street property in every sense that the word author can be made to mean, and that any legal record which fails to reflect this fact is not a record of what happened, but a record of what was allowed to go unchallenged. The room held that sentence for a long moment. Dennis was looking at the table, not at the documents, at the surface of the table itself, the polished wood that reflected his hands. He had been looking at it for several minutes with the expression of a man who is doing a private arithmetic and arriving repeatedly at the same number and finding the number unacceptable and doing the arithmetic again. Jerome Watts spoke quietly to him. Dennis did not respond for a long time. Then he said something one sentence too low for Mara to hear. Watts straightened his papers. "We'll need 30 minutes, he said. Harlan said, "Take what you need." Mara and Harlan sat in a smaller room down the hall and drank water from paper cups and did not say very much. There was not very much to say. The documentation was what it was. Orville Beach's declaration was what it was. Lois Beaumont had spent 21 years preparing a case that she had never expected to present herself, and had made sure through the quiet network of her professional relationships and her own careful planning that it would be presentable when the time came. The time had come. After 26 minutes, Watts knocked on the door. They returned to the conference room. Dennis signed the agreement 40 minutes later. He signed it with the pen that Watts placed in front of him on the line that Watts indicated in the manner of a man completing a transaction he had understood for some time was inevitable and has finally stopped calculating whether there is another way out. He did not look at Mara when he signed. He looked at the line and he signed it, and he put the pen down, and he was done. Mara signed after him. Her hand was steady. The pen moved across the paper with the same consistency she had always brought to her own signature. The characteristic loop at the end of her first name, the one that the forged 2006 document had not known about, present and unmistakable on the line where it had always belonged. The agreement compensated her for the documented value of Grandma Lois's separate family contribution. It compensated her for the independent renovation costs calculated from Cleet Dornbach's job diaries, and the receipts in the blue folder and the ledger entries that matched them to specific phases of the work. It addressed the misattributed professional work product, including the Beaufort Resort project, with a financial acknowledgement that Watts had negotiated down and Harlan had negotiated back up 3 times before they reached a number that both sides could sign. And it placed one sentence into the permanent legal record. Harlan read it aloud before either party signed because he wanted it heard in the room. Mara Calloway made substantial documented contributions to the acquisition, design, restoration, and increased value of the Harlow Street property, and is recognized as the primary creative and financial contributor to said property. The sentence existed now. It was in the record. It had a case number and a jurisdiction and the signatures of both parties. And it was as of that Thursday afternoon in a conference room overlooking Charleston Harbor. A legal fact. Mara sat in her car in the parking structure for a long time afterward. She had the agreement on the passenger seat. The blue folder was in the back in the document case Harlan had returned to her. The harbor was not visible from the parking structure, but she could feel the quality of the air that came in from the water, the particular salt and mud smell of the low country coast, the smell that had been the atmosphere of her adult life for 30 years, that had been in the walls of the house on Harlow Street from the first afternoon she had stood in the kitchen and felt recognized. She read the sentence 3 times. Not because it was difficult to understand, because it existed. Her name, her work. On the record. Not as a footnote, not as a qualifier, not as the unnamed contribution of a woman who had been useful to a man's documented success. In the record, permanently. In language that could not be revised or reclassified or made to disappear by someone who knew how to move things quietly. She did not drive to Harlow Street. She had thought about this in the preceding weeks, had thought about whether she would want to, whether the resolution of the legal matter would make the house feel differently. She had driven past it once in the second week after finding the cabin on a morning when she was coming back through Charleston for a meeting with Harlan. She had slowed as she passed. The magnolia tree was blooming. The porch was freshly painted. Someone had painted it the pale gray she had always said would suit it better than the white Dennis had preferred. The front windows caught the morning light cleanly. It looked like the house she had built. She had felt the pain of that. The specific pain of a thing you made being well tended by someone who did not make it. Then she had felt something settle beneath the pain. Not acceptance exactly. Something more precise than acceptance. The understanding that the house was not what she needed to reclaim. The house was the place where she had learned to disappear. She did not want to win her way back into a room that had taught her to be invisible. She had kept driving. She kept driving now. North on I-26 through the low country that flattened toward the Midlands, through the Midlands that rose toward the Piedmont, through the Piedmont that lifted into the foothills, and then the mountains closing in on both sides with their old patience and their old authority. The sky went from the pale coastal blue to the deeper, harder blue of altitude. The temperature dropped as she climbed. She ran the heater and kept both hands on the wheel and let the distance do what distance does not erase what was behind her, but give it its proper proportion. 300 miles, the white water tower, the Pentecostal church, the gravel road, the hemlocks closing in. The clearing opened. The cabin sat in the last of the afternoon light, the tin roof catching it the way old metal catches light, not reflectively, but absorptively, the way something does when it has been in one place long enough to become part of the landscape rather than an interruption of it. The loose porch railing was fixed now. She had fixed it 2 weeks ago with lumber she had bought in Gatlinburg and brackets she had cut herself at the small workbench she had set up in the corner of the main room. The creek was running well in the early spring snowmelt. She could hear it from the car. She brought the document case and the blue folder inside. She put the folder on the shelf beside Grandma Lois's photograph. Not hidden now, not locked in a tin box under the floor. Protected. Visible. In the place where it belonged, alongside the woman who had prepared it. She made coffee. She stood at the south-facing window with the mug in both hands and looked out at the ridgelines receding in their layers of blue and gray toward the horizon. The light was going. The mountains were doing what mountains do in the last hour of afternoon, absorbing the color of the sky and giving it back in a slightly different form, so that the whole landscape seemed to be lit from within rather than from above. On the long table she had set up under the east window, her work table, the table she had built from reclaimed pine she had found at a salvage yard outside Sevierville. The drawings were spread and weighted with smooth river stones she had collected from the creek. Plans for a 1908 farmhouse outside Maryville that a retired schoolteacher named Dorothea Langham had called about 3 weeks ago, having heard about Mara from a woman in Gatlinburg who had heard about her from Wendell Pruitt, who had apparently been telling people about the woman who had built Harlow Street with her own hands and was now working out of the mountains. The farmhouse needed everything. The east porch was compromised. The original wide plank floors were under 40 years of linoleum. The kitchen had been renovated badly in 1987 and would need to be taken back to the studs. The back garden had been a working kitchen garden in the house's original life and could be again with the right attention to the soil. Dorothea had said everyone I've talked to says it's too far gone. Mara had walked through it on a gray afternoon 2 weeks before, with Dorothea standing in the doorway of each room, watching her the way people watch when they are hoping for a particular verdict. Mara had stood in the kitchen for a long time. The light came through the window above the sink at an angle that would only exist for about 40 minutes each day at that time of year. It fell across the old linoleum in a pattern that was, despite everything, genuinely beautiful. She had turned to Dorothea. "It's not too far gone," she said. "It's been neglected. Those are different things." She was starting on the kitchen first. The kitchen was always where you started, because the kitchen was where the house understood what it was for. She stood at the south window and drank her coffee and watched the light go out of the ridge lines, the way it went each evening gradually and then completely, the layers of blue deepening to gray, deepening to the particular darkness of mountains that have no ambient light to borrow from. The phone rang. She looked at the screen. A number she didn't recognize, Tennessee area code, a Knoxville exchange. She answered. A man's voice, careful and unhurried. "Ms. Calloway, my name is Graham Elstree. I got your name from Dorothea Langham over in Maryville. I have a property in Knoxville, a colonial from 1922. I've had 3 contractors walk through it, and they all told me the same thing, that it's past saving. Mara looked out the south window at the dark where the ridge lines had been. She thought about the house on Harlow Street the first afternoon, the way the light had come through the kitchen window, and she had understood before she could explain it, that the house was not ruined, only waiting. She thought about what Lois had written in the last entry of the composition notebook, in the small, precise hand of a woman who had spent her life believing that accurate records were a form of care. My part is done. The rest is hers. She turned to look at the work table, the drawings, the Riverstone weights, the plans for Dorothea Langham's farmhouse spread under the warm light of the lamp she had placed there for exactly this purpose. The purpose of working in the evening when the house was quiet, and the mountains held the dark, and the work was hers, and only hers. She said, "Tell me about the house, Mr. Elstree." "The house," he told her. She listened, the way she had always listened, not for the problems which were obvious, but for the thing beneath the problems that told you whether the house still knew what it was for. She listened for the bones, for the shape of the original intention underneath the decades of neglect and bad decisions, and the accumulated weight of being owned by people who had not seen it clearly. She heard it. She picked up her pen. Outside, the Smoky Mountains held the night the way they had always held everything, with the uncomplicated authority of something that has been standing in one place long enough to know that what matters is not what is taken from a place, but what is built there, and what the building costs, and whether anyone keeps the record straight. Someone had kept it straight. And Mara Calloway, 58 years old, sitting at a work table in a cabin in the mountains, with a pen in her hand and a client on the phone, and her grandmother's photograph watching from the shelf, was not finished building. She was in every sense that mattered just beginning.